Good evening, everybody. Today's our lecture series. Our topic for today is bedside assessment of cognitive function taken by Dr. A.T. Prabhakar. Dr. A.T. Prabhakar is a neurologist who is currently a professor of neurology in the Department of Neurological Science, CMC Vellore. He obtained his undergraduate and postgraduate medical training from CMC Vellore, and he has joined faculty in 2013 after finishing his MD in clinical neurology at CMC Vellore. And his areas of interest include clinical phenomenology, cognitive neuroscience, lesion-based studies in cognitive neuroscience, decision neuroscience, visual neuroscience, neurophilosophy, and critical care. So, topic for today again, bedside assessment of cognitive function. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Nitin. So I'll share my screen and then we can start. Is my screen visible, Nitin? Okay, so we'll start. Thank you all for joining. So today I'll be talking about the bedside assessment of cognitive function. So we'll start with we'll spend a little time on understanding the theoretical concepts behind it and how to go about practically assessing cognitive function, and how to, the more important thing is not doing the test but actually how to interpret this in the bedside clinical context. So let's start with this cartoon. So at some point in time, all of you must have thought about these things. You must have wondered, where am I going? At least during PG, where am I going? What am I doing? And if you had free time, then maybe you might have pondered over what is the meaning of life. And if all of this is possible, it also tells you that you have a mind that you can work with, and that's what we are going to study today. So you may ask by a simple question: what is the purpose of the mind? And then, so one of the simplest answers is the mind helps you to shift from what you've learned from yesterday. It helps you survive today, and also it helps you predict tomorrow so that you can survive today. So it helps you today by looking back, learning from yesterday's mistakes, predicting future problems, and solving the problems as they come along today. So in order to do that, the tool that we animals have is what we like to call as a mind. And we are here going to test how the mind normally works in people. So we'll start with some concept from evolutionary biology. If uh, if anybody wants to answer this, you're welcome. So this is a picture actually showing some creatures. So do you think it's a plant or an animal? So anybody wants to answer this? Okay, so these, even though they look like plants, these are animals. So these, this is an important creature called as a sea squirt. So this gives you an example of what is the purpose of the nervous system. So the interesting feature about these creatures is that these creatures are seen in the sea, and they, during the larval stage, they are free roaming. So, and they swim about in the in the sea bottom, and they go and eat food, and they search for food. So while they do that, they actually have what is called as the remnants of a brain called as a cerebral vesicle. But as life goes on, they kind of grow and they settle down, like a lot of human beings also. Once they settle down, they digest and eat their own brain. So this creature is a good example to tell us that the main purpose of having a nervous system is for locomotion. So, and locomotion is primarily to survive in a world where food is scarce. So the whole from this concept, if you see that the whole purpose of having a nervous system is locomotion, and in order to have locomotion, you need to perceive what the outside world is. So, and why do you need to perceive the outside world? So that you can act on it. So what are the kinds of action? You can either run away from an object, run towards an object because it's either food, or you are preying on an object. So locomotion is primarily for uh, is a primary purpose of having a nervous system, and there are two components to it. The main component, the first component of is the afferent component, is called as perception, and the purpose of perception is primarily action. So whatever cognitive function it is, you need to know the core two concepts. One is the perception and the other is action. This is a useful concept to hold on to, even though it is that the entire brain, actually, if you take look at the division from the central sulcus, the entire back of the brain, function of the brain is perceptual. Entire anterior part of the brain is action. So you can take any area that you want. So you can look at Broca's area, which is in area 44. You will find that that is a motor area. On the other hand, the Wernicke's area is, which is more posterior, is sensory. So sensory cortex is just behind the central sulcus, and the motor cortex is just anterior to that. So another simple rule is the more further away you move from the sensory cortex, more complex or heteromodal the areas get, and the more anterior to the motor cortex that you get, the more complex the motor movements become. So you can start with simple perception at the level of the sensory cortex, and as you go away, you get more and more complex sensations, and finally you end up with ideas. And you start with simple movements at the motor cortex, and as you go more and more anteriorly, you get more of plans. So this is a simple model that you can remember while you're trying to evaluate patients. Another useful area is this hierarchical kind of models. So there are multiple areas in the brain. So you can have, they are kind of arranged in a hierarchy. So you have the primary areas, then they get connected to the associative areas, which are unimodal. And then you have heteromodal association areas. And each of these follows this primary loop of perception and action. And they all are connected to the environment. They learn from the environment, and they're all connected to each other. So in contemporary cognitive neuroscience, that we find that there are a lot of computational ways of studying the brain. So one of the methods is called as graph theory. So it's widely used in studying social media like Facebook and WhatsApp. So connections are seen as nodes between two, like neurons can be seen as nodes, and the connections are called as edges. So you can see that there are various ways of connecting neurons. So how do you apply all this theoretical knowledge from to a practical point of view? So the simplistic way of understanding this is that there are many ways that neurons are connected in the brain. So you can have one-to-one connection, which you can call, it's almost like serial connections. This classical example is the corticospinal tract. So if you have a lesion in the motor cortex, you will find that you have distal motor weakness in the upper limb or the lower limb, causing hemiparesis. So any lesion along the corticospinal tract will result in the same kind of deficit. So you can have one-to-many projections. So classical example is brainstem reticular formation. So you have a small area like the locus ceruleus, which projects serotonergics to the entire brain. So if you have a lesion somewhere in the brainstem, the entire brain can be affected. So if you have a lesion in the brainstem, the level of consciousness can be affected because it has one-to-many projections. You can also have many-to-one projections. Like the classical example is a descending fiber from the corticospinal tract. So there are multiple fibers that converge on one particular area. So if you have a lesion here, all of these areas will become dysfunction. So coming to another area, interesting thing is that the brain also has many-to-many connections, a lot of parallel connections. This is so much so in the heteromodal association areas. You will find that you remove large chunks of brain in the frontal lobe or in the posterior parietal lobe. Because of these many-to-many connections, you do not get any observable clinical deficit. So how is this useful in understanding higher mental functions and cognitive function is that all cognitive functions can be seen as two categories. One is channel function, the other is state function. So channel functions are one-to-one connections that are seen in the cortex. Classical example is memory, language. Two language areas are connected in a series kind of manner. State function are usually the monoaminergic projections from the brainstem. So classically, these are attentional networks in the reticular activating system starting from the brainstem and projecting throughout the brain. So this causes what is called as arousal and awareness. So in order to have channel functions, you need to have good state functions. This is the most important take-home message from this talk is that you cannot talk about channel functions like aphasia, memory impairment, or visual perceptual abnormalities if state functions are impaired. So if you have to talk about channel functions, you should have normal state functions. So this is the most important take-home message. So in order to understand things, a useful heuristic is to remember what I call as the umbrella model of cognition. So you can have an umbrella here, and you can imagine that this is similar to the brain. The metaphorically, the handle of the umbrella is equivalent to the brainstem, and the canopy of the umbrella is equivalent to the cortical areas. So if you want to find out that your umbrella has multiple holes, you should be able to open the umbrella. If the umbrella is not open, you will not be able to comment on whether the umbrella is functional because of dysfunctional because of holes in the canopy. So state function, and then you have channel function. So state function is classically attention, orientation, and arousal. So in order to comment on channel function like language, memory, and executive dysfunction, you should be able to make sure first that the patient is arousable and has a good attention. So in a patient who's got impaired attention, or who's drowsy or sleepy, or who's depressed because his mood is low, you cannot comment on any of these channel functions. So now coming on, so now we are moving on from theoretical concepts to more practical concepts. So there are, so when you come across patients, you are either interested in assessing their higher mental functions because they have an impaired level of consciousness, or you feel that they have abnormal cognitive functions, either in terms of behavior or motivation, or they're not able to perform activities of daily living. So this is when you're worried about whether this person has got a mental status abnormality. So the first thing to check is arousal and awareness. You call the patient, see if he's responding, and see if he's obeying simple commands. So there are simple screening tests to check for arousal and attention. The simplest test is digit span. So we will go to that. So the most important thing is to just talk to the patient, see if they are arousable, see if you are able to communicate with them. So if you are able to communicate with them, then you can test simple aspects of language and memory. And then you can check other functions like perception, construction. And also you need to assess their personality and emotions and mood, because if patient is not motivated, is not interested in your examination, all your evaluation will be not reliable. So there are a lot of screening tools. So all of you must be familiar with this. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. And you must realize that all of these depend on state functions. So none of them actually check state function so much. So if patient is drowsy or arousable, the validity of this is not correct. So it is always important to spend a lot of time talking to the patient, talking to the bystander, get as much as information as possible. So the most important thing in evaluating cognitive function is to take a detailed history from both the patient and the caregiver and look for discrepancies between both. So these are commonly used screening tools, so which can be administered. You must understand that these depend on state functions as well. There are a lot of rating scales. So again, the validity of rating scales depend on whether the patient is motivated to do and how the patient's attention is. And these are mostly used for looking for changes over time rather than bedside diagnosis. So we won't be going into these in detail. So now we'll go on to what we normally do at the bedside. So the most important thing when you do is all your other cognitive function depends on is attention. So we normally check attention by what is called as a digit span. So easiest test to do is what is called as a forward digit span. We give a numbers which we say 1 per second, and we start with 1 and keep going on till they start making errors. So the patient should be, once you finish completing what you are saying, like say for example, you should say 5, 7, 3, and then ask the patient to repeat this. And you should be saying this in the rate of 1 per second. And if the patient says that correct, then you go on to the next step. And so you keep going on till the patient starts making a mistake. And that is called as a digit span. So normally, if the patient is well motivated to do the study, so the normal digit span, forward digit span would be 5 to 7. And this, if you want to make things a little more complicated, you want patients to manipulate ideas or the things in their mind. You want to look at the digit span backward. Here you ask the patient to reverse what they're saying in a backward direction. So this, a lot of it depends on motivation and whether you're familiar with numbers so this where is variables. Normally it can range somewhere between 2 to 3, and some people who are comfortable with numbers and who have a good working memory, it can be up to 5 to 7. So it also tests mental flexibility and vigilance. There are other common tests that can be done. Stroop test is something that can be done easily. So you ask the person So here is there are various colors that are written here, and you have to mention the color of the text and not what is written. So patients or normal people also will have difficulty in seeing the colors when they are not congruent, and you can actually measure reaction times and see whether the patient's attention is good or not. So this is a common test of vigilance. Vigilance is nothing but sustained attention. So you're able to maintain attention. You have digit span is good. That tells you that your working memory is good. So when you say working memory is good, your connection between your frontal lobe and parietal lobe is good, and the ability to maintain vigilance tells you that not only your attention is good, your mood and motivation is good enough to maintain and sustain attention over long periods of time. So this random A test is a test of vigilance. Here you read this out at 1 per second and ask the person to tap every time they hear the word A. And you look for errors of omission and errors of commission. So normally up to 3 errors of omission are allowed and no errors of commission is allowed. So after you say that your patient's attention is good, that means his arousal is normal, so his reticular activating system is good, and you looked at vigilance is good, that means he can cooperate for your rest of your cognitive examinations. It tells you that he is able to have sustained attention, and it also tells you that your connections between your frontal lobe and parietal lobe networks are good. So next thing is to assess language, because without language and memory, all other cognitive functions cannot be assessed. So easy way to assess language is first checking comprehension. So comprehension is tested by testing two things. You can observe spontaneous speech if the patient is speaking spontaneously, or you can start by checking comprehension. You ask two questions. One is pointing commands and the other is yes no questions. While asking pointing commands, ask for objects that are commonly there, which are commonly used, like the window or curtain, light or fan, and things should be on either side of the visual field. So patient may have neglect or visual field defect. In order to prevent that from hindering your examination, ask for objects on either side of the bedside. So if they're able to answer pointing commands, then it tells you that they're able to comprehend what you're speaking to them. Also, you could ask yes no questions, like things that are objective, so things that you can verify. So are you in the hospital? Is your name so and so? And these will tell you whether the comprehension is intact or not. So comprehension tells you that your Wernicke's area by the classical model is intact. So next thing you want to do is to see whether the arcuate fasciculus, which connects the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area, is intact. You would ask the person to repeat. You can start with a single word and make it many more words. So usually the number of words a person can repeat will be one more than the digit span. You can also assess naming. Naming is usually localized to the bilateral anterior temporal lobes and its connection to the rest of the brain. So it has very little localizing values. We normally ask patients to name objects, body parts, and parts of objects and colors. So once you've done this, you also want to assess fluency. Fluency is easiest assessed by spontaneous speech and by observing the patient. So there are two tests. One is called as category fluency test, which you ask the patient to name as many animals or categories of other common objects like vegetables as fast as possible in 1 minute. So usually patients, a normal person should be able to name 10 to 11, 10 to 12 objects of the same particular category. And commonly we ask animals. So animals, they should be able to shift from domestic animals to wild animals and from birds to other categories. So this is not only a test of language, it's also a test of frontal executive function and also of memory search strategies. You could also do a similar thing called as a phonemic fluency. We ask them, give a particular word, alphabet, or say in Hindi we say ka, pa, ma, or in Indian languages we use ka, pa, ma, or in English we say F, A, and S, and the person has to say the number of words starting with those. You can also assess reading and writing to look for any deficits. Once you assess language, language is reasonably good, then you can check memory. You already tested memory by checking digit span. So memory can be looked at immediate or working memory, recent memory, and remote memory. So immediate memory is tested by digit span, and also whether patient is paying attention to what you're doing, is able to understand the task. That will tell you whether he's got immediate memory or working memory. Recent memory can be either visual or verbal. So you can ask them simple things like what they had for breakfast and validate it with the bystander. Other things that you could do is give 3 words and ask the patient to remember it after 5 minutes. And you could also give pairs of words. Initially, if you want to test, you can give related words, or you can give unrelated words, and then you can ask them to remember it, recall it after 5, 10, and 30 minutes. So similarly, to assess visual memory, either you can show them you can either show them 3 objects and hide it in some common places around the bed, or show 3 pictures in a collection of multiple pictures and then later ask them to say which one they had seen. Then you go on to check remote memory. So remote memory can be episodic or semantic memory. So episodic memory, you ask for personal information, historical facts. And in semantic memory, you ask for, you can do the category fluency test, or you can ask them for meaning of common words and objects. So once you assess this, the next thing to assess is the ability to construct. So now we move on from, now we are looking at perceptual function and the ability to act on motor acts. So here we ask simple things like a star or a triangle, and it can become more and more complex depending on what you're suspecting clinically. So you can also ask the patient to draw to command. So you can ask them to draw a flower pot, a house in perspective, and clock drawing. So constructional ability depends both on not only on visual perception, but also on planning and execution. So the way you plan and execute it also. So you can actually pick up parietal lobe dysfunction, frontal lobe dysfunction, and constructional apraxia with these drawing tasks. Calculation is localized usually to the parietal networks, traditionally to the angular gyrus. So you can give simple calculations, and if they are good at it and you're still suspecting a parietal lobe dysfunction, you can give written calculations which are a little more complex. Next is going on to praxis. So praxis is the ability to do learned motor acts. So learned motor acts are stored as programs in the parietal lobe where concepts of tools and tool use is kept. And this information goes along from the parietal lobe to the supplementary motor areas and goes through the corpus callosum to bilateral supplementary motor areas, and from there to the motor cortex. So this is assessed by either transitive actions or intransitive actions. So you can ask the patient to demonstrate how they comb their hair, brush their teeth, use scissors, or you can ask them to wave goodbye, say namaste. And if they're not able to, and you can ask them to imitate gestures. And so the things how you can do is that the parietal lobe is the one that has knowledge of gestures. And what you could do is you can show them namaste and ask them the meaning of that, or you can say, give them a gesture and ask them what it means. So gestural knowledge and conceptual knowledge of tools will tell you that the parietal lobe is intact. So if you can give them a verbal command and ask them to do a salute, they're not able to do, tells you that the connection from the language area to the praxis network is impaired, and that is called as a disconnection kind of apraxia. So if patient fails in all of this, you can ask them, you can give them a real object, like you can give them a comb or a toothbrush and see if they're able to use it. So another way to assess praxis is to give a collection of these tools, and you can ask them, what is this used for and what is the action of one of these tools. So this is to assess the concept of tool use. The other parietal lobe function is the ability to differentiate the right from the left. So spatial processing happens predominantly in the right parietal lobe, and lesions of the parietal lobe will result in deficits in right and left orientation. So you can ask the patient to identify right or left on themselves, or you can give them cross commands on the self, or you can ask them to identify on the examiner. You can also ask them to identify fingers. So if you have inability to say right and left, and you have finger identification deficit, and you have acalculia, we call it a condition called as Gerstmann syndrome. Also, you can look for tactile gnosis by looking for stereognosis and 2-point discrimination. So this is also another parietal lobe function. Another important parietal lobe function is to look for neglect, especially right parietal lesions. So right parietal lobe codes for spatial information on both sides of the field. So right parietal lesions, you can have what is called as neglect. So in neglect, what we do is we give a line cancellation test. So you can draw multiple alphabets and you can ask the patient to tick off all the A's, or you can, if they're not educated, you can ask them to cross lines and see if they miss out on one particular side. So this will look for neglect. Also, you could do something what is called as line bisection, where you ask them to cross the line. So patients with a neglect will shift towards one side that they're not neglecting. Going on to other perceptual functions, so we give a complex picture, and you can ask them, you can give them simple objects first and see if they're able to identify those objects. And you can give a complex picture like the cookie thief picture, or we have a modified culturally adapted one where there are multiple pictures. You can ask the patient to identify all the objects and describe the scene. So if they're able to identify only individual objects and not all the other objects, it tells you that the patient has got some problems with visual attention and is not able to see multiple objects simultaneously, which is called as simultagnosia. You can also assess language function, and you can also assess neglect and field defects using the same test. Another thing that we look for is the famous face identification. You can give commonly known faces and see if the person can recognize these faces. So also you can look for facial recognition. So these are all perceptual tasks that we are testing. So all of these are localized to the occipitotemporal region. And if you have lesions in bilateral occipitotemporal region, then you will have deficits in recognizing faces or in recognizing facial emotions. So going on to the most variable of all these things is also called as the executive function. So executive function is none other than all the steps that are necessary for goal-directed behavior. So goal-directed behavior, you need to have a goal. Once you have a goal, you need to have mood and motivation to move towards the goal. And in order to do that, you need to have a plan, and each plan is nothing but multiple small sub goals and how to reach all of these sub goals and how to shift from one goal to the other. So in order to, so executive function, you need to have a goal and have goal directed behavior, which is mood and motivation. And in order to do that, you have multiple sets or sub goals, and you should be able to shift from one set to the other and complete the task. And while doing that, you should not let other tasks that are competing with it to interfere. So simple things that you normally check is alternating sequences. So you can either by using a motor luria where you ask the patient to tap in different patterns or to draw a particular pattern which is alternating. Here, the two alternating motor programs have to be consistently shifted. So patients who have deficits in this set shifting ability will continue drawing the same pattern again and again, and that is called as perseveration, and that is localized to the dorsolateral frontal networks. The go no go is another test that checks for inhibitory response. So when you're doing a particular task, so you should be able to monitor it and stop unnecessary action. So go no go is a simple way to do is when you tap once, you ask the patient to tap twice, and when you tap twice, and you ask the patient not to tap. And patients who have deficits in the connection between the orbitofrontal cortex to the rest of the brain will have deficits in inhibitory response. Another important function of the frontal lobe is to have to conceptualize. To conceptualize, you should be able to look at larger categories or look at objects as part of a larger category and look at similarities. So for example, we check similarities by saying that what is the similarity between table and chair? And the answer that you're looking for is that both are part of a larger category of objects called as furniture. And answers like they're both wood is not what we are looking for. So we need to look at a larger category. So for example, you can say that apples and oranges are part of the larger category called as fruits. So similarities is another way to check frontal or executive function. Another thing that we look at is insight, judgment, and so we look at proverb interpretation that tells us about the patient's uh, uh, and judgment. So we ask the patient what happens if there is fire in the room, and see what the patient's response is. So insight tells us whether the patient has knowledge of his deficit and whether he is aware of what is happening to him. So it also tells us whether the patient is accepting of it or whether he has an anosognosia where he is unaware of his deficit. So going on to another thing that we should be checking more common, but we don't, is social cognition. So social cognition, some of the main domains are, one is social perception, is the ability to look at people's faces or body language and assess what they're thinking or what they're feeling. And the other is called as theory of mind. So the theory of mind is the ability to take another person's point of view. So if you see, looking at social perception, if you see the column on the pictures on the column on the left, you can see that this lady is looking to one side. And if you're wondering why she's looking, if you see the next picture in the next row, you see that she's looking at another person, and another person is talking to her. So you can ask the person why such a conversation is happening, and you will try to understand the social dynamics. So this is called as social perception. So on here, on the other hand, on the right side, you can see a particular task where you find that Anthony is reading a book. He leaves it on the table, and when he goes off to another room, at that time, Sonia comes, takes the book, and leaves it uh, in the drawer and goes off. And when Anthony comes back, you ask the patient, where will he look for the uh, where will he look for the book? So people who have deficits in theory of mind will not be able to take his perspective, and they'll say that the book, he'll look for the book in the drawer, and will not be able to say that he'll look for it on the table. So there are a lot of tasks that can assess theory of mind as well. So problems of frontal executive networks can also result in deficits in social cognition. So so that's the end of the slides, and I'll be happy to take any questions. So any questions?
If there are any questions, kindly put your doubts in the chat box. So one doubt,
Yeah.
concerned, apart from the today's topic, the role of neuroimaging in assessment of cognitive function, are there any specific indications?
Mm, yeah. So there are two conditions that we would assess cognitive dysfunction. So one is an acute condition, and the other is a chronic one. So acute changes in functional status are usually problems with state function. So common causes of state function dysfunction is either a metabolic cause, or a systemic cause, or a structural lesion. So if you find focal deficits and altered levels of consciousness, like say if you find cranial nerve deficits and or pupillary abnormalities and altered levels of consciousness or arousal, then our localization is to the brainstem, and so we would definitely need a structural brain imaging. So if you don't find any lateralizing symptoms, it may be another condition. Depending on the clinical context, it may be a hyponatremia or hypercalcemia, or it could be a systemic infection causing a delirium. So in acute condition, so the role of neuroimaging is primarily guided by presence of other focal neurological deficits. In that case, you will think of a structural lesion. So you need to go ahead and image the patient. So if you find that the clinical context is explainable, so somebody on a diuretic comes with a hyponatremia and has got altered levels of consciousness, the role of neuroimaging is less. Coming to the more insidious onset, gradually progressive cognitive decline, on the other hand, would definitely need structural brain imaging, because very often you can have slow growing lesions that can present. So depending on the clinical context, simple CT may do, or you may want to do an MRI, and there are newer methods such as PET that are available, and you can actually quantify the brain atrophy in various areas. Uh, so from a bedside clinical point of view, it may not. It's mostly to rule out other causes, but from a research perspective, there's a lot of role for neuroimaging as a biomarker and to predict which particular dementia that you're dealing with. Yeah.
Any more questions? Kindly put your questions in the chat box. there are no more questions. Sir, thank you so much on behalf of Department of Medicine for giving your valuable time, sir, and that excellent presentation on bedside assessment of cognitive function. Thank you again, sir.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
thank you, sir. And our next session will be on laws in medicine, which will be on 11th of March at 3 p.m. Sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all.